I wanted to have a look back at the week in political terms, and who better to do that than my next guest, my first guest, Joseph Cotry-Monson, who's a lawyer, broadcast and all-round friend of the show. Joseph, thank you so much for joining me today. I'm not sure, do you celebrate Easter?
Well, I certainly do. I'm not quite home yet, but we will be doing an elaborate Easter egg hunt with my daughter in the garden tomorrow. She's a good reader now at 6 years old, so there will be written clues, which she might not appreciate to start with. She'll be straight after the chocolate. There's a process, and she'll have to abide by it.
Of course, there's a process. You're a lawyer. I mean, she'll be reading from papers. So let's talk about it.
Happy Easter to you, Trisha, and happy Easter to everybody at home.
Thank you. Let's have a look at the headlines in the legal news. I want to start off when we're talking about children. As 12-year-old boy appearing in court. I hate that they put in that he smiled, because when you look, he fidgeted, he smiled. He's in court. He was accused of murdering a quote-unquote warm and loving 60-year-old foster mother. Appeared in court. She was run over with a car outside her home in Sheffield. Obviously, as it's a child, that we don't get too much detail. Now, some people have said, should there be anonymity for 12-year-olds? To me, that's not a question. To me, I read this whole story with a whole lot of sadness, because it mentioned, I don't know what the circumstances are, mentioned that this lady is also a foster mother. Now, I think I've mentioned before, I spent a year training to be an adoptive parent. So, I get very angry when I see these dog whistle headlines, because I know there's a lot of trauma for everybody involved in this case. So what are your thoughts on removing anonymity from children?
Well, first of all, I think you're spot on, Trisha, about the reporting the smile. 12-year-olds, 11-year-olds presented with a situation that overwhelms them. What's a very common response you see in teenage girls as well as teenage boys, smiling, being nervous, and that's interpreted as some kind of bloodthirsty smile of achievement in whatever rag, and you're right, it's dog whistle stuff. It's also important to look at the context, which we don't know. We've got a couple of clues, don't we, Trisha? And straight away you're on it. Foster child who's looked after, potential of, and we don't know this because of the way it's reported, but quite likely damaged. The children are not taken away from their parents for no reason. Not saying that the social services always get it right, but the reality is that many and most of children who are looked after have suffered some kind of significant trauma. And that development at a young age, which is severely impaired, as it often is, can result in terrible consequences. That's not to say, of course, that such a thing as evil in children does not exist. It does. And we've seen it. It's often a combination. There are many evil children who go on to have quite selfish but productive and unremarkable lives.
Yes.
But
absolutely. No, I agree. I mean, many of it's like train tracks, what happens in youth, but you're absolutely right. Now, I've done a lot of work when talking to prisoners, and each and every one, the one question you ask them, when was that moment when you thought, never again? This is not going to happen to me again. And some of the things that they talk about, lashing out because they thought they were going to be raped, beaten, the list goes on. So we don't know about this, and I think
that's right. And I don't walk in their shoes, and Trisha, neither of you and neither of many of us. And it's important to resist where possible that instinct, that reflex to want to be judgmental and not look at some of the things in our own lives that we're probably not too proud of that other people don't know about. No. With regard to anonymity,
especially at this time of the year. Let's move on to. I do laugh at these headlines. I really do laugh at these headlines. Phone a fiend. Furious evil killers Wayne Couzens and Ian Huntley will get phones installed in their prison cells. This is inmates at HMP Franklin. They use the word lags. I didn't realise anybody called people in prison lags before. Contractors are putting in phone lines so that they can have phones, and they say prisoners including child murderer Huntley, serial killer Belfield, and rape killer ex-cop Couzens have single cells with TVs, wash basins, and toilet facilities.
Trisha,
I despair about reporting.
Okay, first of all, in the spirit of fairness, Trisha, 10 out of 10 for the pun. Phone a fiend. The headline writer at The Sun earned his money on that day, did he not? Or she?
Yes,
now,
yes.
The lags thing, I think it's a word that's only used in The Sun and the Daily Mail. I've never heard anybody use it outside that context. And of course, I've met a few of them. Certainly no prison officers call inmates lags. I also hate, and it's kind of that context dog whistling thing we were talking about. Isn't it really depressing when they just give these 2 or 3 examples of the very worst people who are in that institution, when in fact there are lots of people on long-term sentences who are being managed out of prison, who will be released and have served long sentences, but have been undertaking a process of rehabilitation. More on that in a minute, Trisha. But the perception when you read the article in a non-cynical way is you should read everything in print, really. You should read it with a degree of cynicism.
Oh, yes.
This is 700 Huntleys all together with the stains on their character and conscience of their horrible crimes, waiting to commit horrible offences over the phone and bother people. Of course it's not. And telephones are incredibly important in prison for a couple of reasons. But Trisha, they're difficult logistically to manage because you have prisoners who are going out to cells, out of their cells, only allowed out at certain times. In some institutions, as little as half an hour to an hour a day in total, including their time when they go and get their food, which they then must eat in their cell. And there are arguments, there's the possibility for violence, and prison officers do not want that difficult life of violent prisoners and fights, putting them at risk, putting other prisoners at risk, necessitating ambulances to have to come to prison, and God forbid an investigation as a result of a prisoner being killed. Prisons are dangerous places. Boris Becker told us the other day in his video, prison is dangerous. Whatever you hear about prison being some kind of holiday camp, Boris says, forget the good Boris. Boris Becker, Boris says, forget it. It's a difficult one because the reality is that it's management of prisoners in the context of overcrowding, risk of violence, limited staff. We've had the massive cuts, prison service, frankly, not fit for purpose. It's not their fault. It's government funding costs. We talk about it all the time since 2008. We're all in this together, but there's also a longer term aspect of this, rehabilitation. And it's important to recognize that many of these people, they not just...
They've got families.
Yeah, and also not having contact with their families punishes the families. That's one aspect. But also by maintaining those links in order for them to be able to come out into a situation where they're not deprived of a support network and more likely to flounder and reoffend. These are important things. But I want to say something else about this, Trisha, that's not obvious. There's a reason that prison authorities and police, in fact, like prisoners to have phones. And official phones, not mobiles. Those phone calls are recorded. It's a way of gathering intelligence, Trisha. It's tremendously valuable.
Yes.
Phone calls are listened to. Not only can you only phone certain people, so that should reassure that Huntley isn't going to be calling other
children or something,
critics or children,
and it's after 7. They can't make calls after 7 p.m. There are lots of restrictions on it.
There are, and only to certain numbers where there's agreement from the numbers. So if an inmate wants to call me to instruct Joseph Godfrey Monson to represent him in his case, well, in order to do that, he has to first clear that number to be authorized. And I or my firm will get a phone call saying, do you accept this prisoner to be able to call you? And of course we say yes, but this is a process. So it's regulated for the safety of the public, but it's monitored to the benefit of the police.
There you go. Thank you. Thank you. That gives us some insight behind the headlines. And I know people are going to be saying, you know, because of the wash basins and TVs and that, oh, then they should be doing hard time and they, well, you know, all that sort of thing. As Boris Becker said, they do indeed. And if you don't like, if you get angry, I'd say to the audience, if you get angry about prisoners, these prisoners being in there and all that, I say to people, Joseph, do something about it, which is become an adoptive parent or foster carer and look after children before they are so damaged that they go into the prison system. Otherwise, put up or shut up.
Yeah, Trisha, you know what? It's all very well complaining about the amount of rubbish on the streets, but, you know, just making a bit of an effort to pick up a bit of litter probably is not the worst idea in the world.
Brilliant one. This draconian law, whether you think it's a draconian law or not, letting staff sue bosses over rude customers, it's been shelved apparently because there's been a Tory party backlash. It was a law that was proposed that would let staff sue employers if a customer offends them, gives them a hard time. If enacted, the bill would make employers liable for staff being harassed by third parties, such as customers or members of the public. It would introduce a legal requirement for companies and public bodies to, quote unquote, take all reasonable steps to prevent harassment by third parties, don't know how you do that, related to a protected characteristic, such as sex, gender, reassignment, or age. If I'm not mistaken, one of the organisations that was interested in this is Beck2, because of all the harassment recently now of people on stage. This is a new one, apparently, since COVID. People going to see plays and musicals, screaming and shouting and harassing people on stage. That's one of the many things. Would this have worked? Not just that, but would this have really worked in law? I'm thinking if a customer came in and gave you a really hard time or tried to hit you or something like that. I mean, is that why this law was created or thought about?
I don't think there's anything that new here, because employers already have to provide a circumstance, a situation as much as is reasonably practicable. That's one of the phrases that pops up in every bit of legislation where it's not easy to measure. They have a duty to make a working environment safe in as much as they can. Already exists. Okay, so for example, if there are circumstances, you see it all the time, don't you? Because every time you go into there's a post office or a police custody desk. Yeah. You're not speaking directly to them, are you? You've got your little crack in the glass, and it stops fists flying through and probably stops people spitting.
And there's signs, aren't there? Now, you mentioned, I've seen signs that our staff won't take, if you do this, that, and the other, and there are cameras there. So that you're saying there's already been legislation.
And this will happen. I mean, I also think, however, that this business of insults becoming more prevalent, especially when you deal with, for example, call centers, which is the way that most of us now interact with the companies that we have relationships with, your IT or your phone company or your mobile company or your gas or whatever. It's all call centers, isn't it? And what's been happening last couple of years with call centers? Who's got an hour and a half free to wait on hold? And as it's about to connect, the phone goes dead and you have to call again. And what's the first thing that happens? You call HMRC. We were having a little rant about them a few weeks ago, weren't we, Trisha? You're on hold for ages trying to pay your taxes. And what does the message say in that lovely Scottish accent on the line? It says, we will not accept or tolerate our staff being abused. Why do they have to put that? Because they're already treating us like laboratory mice. waiting
Exactly.
for an hour and a half, getting more and more irate because we're not spending time with our children. We're trying to get the dinner ready. We're trying to get on with the business of life. Instead,
trying to pay our flipping taxes. I mean, you have to try to pay them. But are you saying that? So this whole idea of this law was a bit of a furphy, a bit of a waste of time, because there are already things, already legislation there. So somebody actually put this up to them, suggested it, and then wasted time. Listen, we've got to take a break, but I wanted to come back after the break and talk about a couple more headlines. Don't go away. This is Talk TV. Welcome back. I'm with Joseph Cotring-Monson. We're talking the headlines when it comes from a legal point of view and a different point of view. Joseph, this caught my eye. Guess why? I mean, and I'm going to say I did go to a private school. Going to private school makes you twice as I'll start that again. Can't read. Going to private school makes you twice as likely to vote Tory. Study finds. Oh, that failed with me. Having a private school education means a person is twice as likely to become a loyal Conservative voter as someone with a state education, regardless of wealth, class background. This is researchers from the University College of London. Now, what struck me about this particular bit, and I read this, you'll enjoy this. Although only 7% of the general population are privately educated, 41% of Conservative MPs, 44% of newspaper columnists, and a third of the British chairs of FTSE 100 companies went to independent schools. That's according to the Sutton Trust, a charity which aims to improve social mobility. Last year, it highlighted that 19 out of the 31 members of Rishi Sunak's cabinet were privately schooled, a similar ratio to the cabinets of Liz Truss and Boris Johnson. Let me try and use my best acting skills to say, oh, what a shock.
Well, I'm not a former movie star, Trisha, like you. But I do have to say there's a couple of stories going on here, and it's important to separate them, I think. And I say this as a Manchester grammar boy whose parents paid fees until my father sadly died, and then the school paid them for me. So I'm incredibly grateful for all of that. The top level of society is privileged, it's educated, and it's promoted into the high levels of the organizations that you've talked about. That's one part of it, kind of preferment, the old boys club, whatever you're going to call it. Yes. And I suspect a different question to the one of whether somebody goes in a moderate and to some of these institutions, especially the old school Harrow and Eton and Winchester or whatever, whether they go in a moderate, maybe a bit left leaning, and they come out wearing their tweeds and getting their shotgun ready to go and do crap shooting. Are they cultural programming establishments, these institutions? I'm not sure, Trisha. It's a bit chicken and egg, and
I'm not sure.
Maybe more chicken.
It is
than
because here's the interesting thing as well. This study also showed apparently that if you went to university as well, it was likely to erode a lot of that, if you like, conservative leaning. You'd come back. And people like me who came from, I mean, my first years of my life were in a caravan. My parents had 4 kids under 4. Accommodation because my mother was black. I mean, in those days, it was no Irish, no blacks, and no dogs. So they lived in a caravan, 4 of us under 4. My mother came over to join the National Health Service as a nurse, worked her guts out. My parents worked 2 jobs. I won a place at a very prestigious school, and a bursary paid my fees. We did school elections, and I was the first, the one, the only person who stood for Labour. And I got 1 vote from 1 teacher who was a mentor of mine. Was it? But no, I thought it interesting that when you, and I'm very travelled, and I come from a very travelled family, and I'm probably a very left-leaning family. But I thought it interesting when you look at, I'd say they look at Rishi Sunak. I wouldn't be surprised if there wasn't a similar equation when it came to the Labour government as well. There is a proliferation of privately educated or independently educated people running the country. And it's not necessarily because the education's better.
Yeah, none of this stuff is news. We've had Labour prime ministers since the Second World War, and they've all been, Clement Attlee was at University College, Oxford. That's not it's not the local poly, is it? And that kind of chicken and egg thing. Well, the intake to these schools is rich. They're natural Tory voters anyway, and that's. There may be an element of kind of the culture of monarchism, imperialism, kind of the army. Many people, I'm sure it's borne out by statistics if it's checked that you're much more likely to become an army officer if you've been to some of these really Premier League private public schools, I should say. But there's also this kind of psychological thing, isn't there? And that's that if you're in an environment, you're naturally going to gravitate towards the atmosphere around you. And what you perceive your own interests to be, if you're in a kind of not just a gifted environment, but a privileged one, that's not direct brainwashing. Which is kind of what the story seems to be aiming at. It's just a kind of psychological tendency. But yeah, I mean, it's in Manchester Grammar, we had those same type of elections in '97, and it was a landslide for the Tories, not for Labour. and it was probably pretty similar numbers on the opposite way, in the opposite way to the ones that favoured Tony Blair in that May election back in the '90s.
Absolutely. It's always interesting talking to you, Joseph. Have a really happy Easter, and I hope your daughter gets lots of Easter eggs. She'll probably solve several cases on the way to doing that, Joseph. Oh dear, we do get through some headlines. Whether you agree or disagree, I'd love to hear from you. Joseph Cotchy-Monson, lawyer and broadcaster.